Okay, I'd like to introduce Professor Ashish Arora from Carnegie Mellon University. From Duke, oh, sorry. From Duke University, who will be talking about the chemical industry. And I'm looking for your slide here. You're here, right? Maybe lessons? That's lessons from the internet? No, accelerating is the innovation. How about this one? Yes, got it. There we go.
Good morning, thank you very much. As Rebecca's introduction indicated, I've recently changed employers. So the chemical industry, and I'm mostly going to be talking about from the history of the industry rather than the more recent developments. But I think I hope you'll see that it's of use. The first thing to note is the chemical industry came of age at a very different time, when large-scale government involvement in the economy was definitely the exception rather than the norm. Despite that, and in this sense, it's sort of an exception to what Brian just said. If you see, this is a chart from 1971 NSF figures. This is the share of basic. It shows you two things, and I'll summarize what it shows in the interest of time. It shows that the chemical industry was extremely R&D intensive, and it funded most of this research through private dollars. Okay? So at this point, we could sort of, since this is mostly about public policy, we might want to stop and say, well, there's not a great deal to be learned. But in fact, I would submit to you there are some very interesting things that we can learn from this. There is one prominent instance where the government intervened very heavily in innovation, and this was the synthetic rubber project during the Second World War. Around 1941, there's about 10,000 tons of synthetic rubber being produced in America, and there's this very real fear that America will be cut off from the supplies of natural rubber. So the primary objective, in some ways resembling, well, not with the same, we don't quite have the same urgency, but there's the sense that we needed to increase. At that time, there was a very clear sense that we needed to increase the supplies of production of synthetic rubber. There was a public-private academic partnership set up. Lots of firms were involved in this, both rubber firms, petrochemical firms, university departments. And this was then extended after World War II. This program, in some ways, was a smashing success. So the output of synthetic rubber increased 85 times, which is quite incredible. 7 times peak German production, and mind you, this was using German technology. This technology essentially had been, was ready for prime time. This was the butadiene styrene technology. So it succeeded in its primary objective, which was to increase the supplies of synthetic rubber. It had a couple of subsidiary objectives, which was improvements in polymer science and improvements in quality, and there the success was much less pronounced. In particular, if you think about contributions to polymer science, observers of this program have concluded that the contribution was modest at best. Right? There were significant improvements at this time. Most of them came from sources that were outside the program. The conclusion, I guess, at least I draw from this, is programs that are about increasing supplies are very different from programs that are about increasing knowledge, about increasing innovation, and we must not confuse them. Right, the second point that Dr. Coonan mentioned is this idea that change comes very slowly. And this is the chart of how synthetic fibers have diffused. And the top blue line here is cotton. And this purplish line here is synthetic man-made fibers of all kinds. And this only, you can see this is about 80, 100-year period, a century old. And it takes 70 years before man-made fibers overtake cotton. And Professor Koonin basically laid out the reasons why this is so. And it's just worth emphasizing that this is a general tendency of all producer goods. Anything that gets used as an input in somebody else's production tends to have this property. There is an interesting exception, which I want to talk to you about, which is the switch from coal to oil as a feedstock in the chemical industry. I don't know if you can read any of this stuff here, so let me just read it out for you. In 1950, well, actually, in 1938, when nylon is discovered and DuPont trumpets the introduction of nylon, it is made from coal, air, and water, not petroleum, air, and water, as it eventually will actually be made. That's the central role that coal played in chemical production, not as an energy source, but as an input. In a short decade, things changed quite dramatically. So 1950, 50% of U.S. organic chemical output was based on natural gas and oil. By 1966, 1.5 decades, it's 88%. The change is even more dramatic in Europe, for obvious reasons. In 1949, only 9% of British organic chemical output was based on gas and oil. In 1962, it's 63%. The first petrochemical plant in Germany is started in the 1950s. By 1973, 90% of organic chemical output is oil-based. Right? So this was a fairly dramatic change. It takes about a decade and a half or 2 decades. And the remarkable part is there was very little government intervention in this. In other words, no government mandated this. There was no large-scale government subsidies. To some extent, this tells you that the point that Rebecca made earlier, when you have a clear demand, and it's seen as going to be persistent, private sector will respond and will make these large-scale changes. Now, there were some other things that happened alongside this required major developments and advances in technology. It required a very significant diffusion of this technology. And this diffusion, too, in contrast to what Brian presented about agriculture, was mediated by markets, by profit-oriented firms. And that's what I want to get to next. This picture here is a picture of an oil refinery in India, in Jamnagar in 1997, which took place with almost no comment in the world press. By marked contrast, when a company introduced a small car in India, it was on the front pages of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. What's remarkable about this refinery? It was the biggest refinery in the world, the biggest grassroots refinery in the world, built at a cost of $6 billion then, and has been expanded. The capacity has been doubled. It's now $12 billion cost. It made India, for the first time, a net exporter of gasoline, believe it or not. But that's not the most interesting part. There are 2 parts I want you to focus on. First, that it happened without comment. Okay, you might say, well, refining is boring. So is car technology. The internal combustion engine is about as old as refining, if not older. Okay? The fact that it should happen without comment tells you we take it for granted. Yes, this technology is a commodity. Listed here are the key technology suppliers. Let me read out. Bechtel, Black and VTech, Dow Global, Foster Wheeler, UOP, Criterion Catalyst, Stone & Webster, Davy Power Gas. It's a market. You can buy this stuff. By contrast, think of what it is like in automobiles. Tata had to develop more or less a lot of its technology internally. This tells you what a difference it makes if there is a market or if there is not. Okay? I won't belabor this chart, but this tells you what the sources of technology and engineering expertise are for plants globally, petrochemical plants globally all over the world in 1980 and 1990. A very large fraction of the technology is sourced externally and can be purchased on a market. That's the takeaway I want you to take away from this. Put differently, much of the diffusion of petrochemical technologies in the world has taken place through markets. And these technologies are being actively sold by profit-oriented firms, both large and small. Right, so that's the last part of my presentation now, which is coming to, so what made this possible? Rebecca had highlighted these three things, but I just want to exemplify them. These SEFs that you see here are specialized engineering firms. These are engineering contractors whose business is to supply technologies for chemical plants. Sometimes they also develop new technologies and offer them for license. In other cases, they act as agents for the original innovator. The first, and this is a sort of a summary of what my research has shown and the research of others, the first takeaway is that these kinds of markets flourish, this sort of market for technology flourishes when you've got vigorous competition in the downstream product market. The best way to illustrate this is with the story of UOP. Most of you don't know, but the most important source of refining technology over the last century has been a company called Universal Oil Products, which is a company outside Chicago. When this company started, it was competing with Standard Oil, right? And so this company's business model was, it was the technology supplier to the independents. Now, without vigorous antitrust, there would not have been any independent refiners in America. There would not have been a market for UOP. We would have missed some of the most important advances in refining technology without UOP. So the first thing is you need competitive product markets if you want this kind of competition in, or if you want this vigorous technology market. Second, and you may have missed this, when you have these kinds of companies like UOP, one thing fundamentally changes with the product companies themselves. Oil companies have been remarkably open in terms of licensing their own technology. BP, Shell, and even Exxon have vigorous licensing programs for their technology. One reason is, if they don't, somebody else will. You can no longer keep this held because there's now a market out there. So that's what this chart shows. This chart shows when you have these SEFs or independent contractors active in licensing, then the incumbent producers, the chemical and the petrochemical firms, are also active in licensing their technologies. A related point to this, and again I'll go back to the history, is therefore you need to think about antitrust not just in the product market, but also in the technology markets. And the US Department of Justice and the FTC, with Rich Gilbert and others, have been very active in this aspect of it and making sure that we don't get monopolies up in the technology market as well. Finally, this goes back to IP. Patent protection appears not to have hurt a very robust market for technology diffusion in the chemical industry. In particular, these specialists, these technology specialists, do well when they have patent protection. In fact, they require patent protection to compete against the large established companies. That's my last slide. So on the first column, you have what I think are the main takeaways from the history itself, which is this is an example of an industry which was the first science-based industry. This was the first time we had the systematic application of science for economic purposes to design new materials, starting with synthetic dyes and then moving on. That despite this strong science-based character, this was funded largely by private funds. Government support for basic research was an exception rather than the rule. One reason why this was so, because there was a very clear route from science to dollars, or from science to being able to make money. And there was significant increase in demand. So I didn't get to talk about this because I wanted to move through. But for example, in the 1920s and 1930s, the growth of the automobile had a significant effect in encouraging investments in refining technologies, in new types of plastics, lacquers, finishes, that kind of stuff. And not only has this industry relied on private dollars for innovation, it's also relied on the market for diffusing these innovations. Universities have played a very important role, but for the most part, it's been in institutionalizing the disciplines, the knowledge, and in training people, rather than as an active source of new technologies. What are the implications that we see from the history for energy innovation? And I don't want to overclaim, or let me sort of qualify these. I've overstated them in the interest of being clear. As George Orwell once said, it's better to be clear and wrong than to mumble. So I'm going to be try to be clear and wrong, which is, it suggests government programs are much better at coordinating large-scale production when the technology exists than in bringing forth radically new technologies. That support for the demand for new technologies is probably much more effective, or is at least as important as trying to subsidize the creation of new technologies. And third, we should not neglect diffusion. It does no good to have new technologies if they are not widely deployed for either of the two objectives. And in this, I would recommend to you that competitive markets, both in the product space and in the technology space, are very important. Thank you.
We do have time for a couple of questions. Does anyone have questions for Professor Arora?
Yes, I'm Philip Weber, Congressional Budget Office. On your table of the specific technologies that were the big share by the independent firms and the not independent firms, air separation was really different. The reason I am asking this is that carbon capture and sequestration, one of the biggest cost elements is the separation of the CO2, and it's very inefficient now and very low. What are the factors that make that the in-house, rather the SEF role so low for the air separation technology?
So it's a good question. My sense is one reason the share is low is because the producers have been very active in licensing their technologies. Air Products, BOC, Linde, these were all very active in licensing out their own technology. And I think at least they actively had business models where they would help you engineer their plant. So there was less of a scope, I think, for independent suppliers for plant design. So the producers were also doing this as a business.
Any other questions? Please.
I'm David Mitch from University of Maryland, Baltimore County. I'm just struck by the contrast with the previous presentation in terms of private versus government. I'm not sure I'm completely clear on why the chemical industry might have been different than agriculture. I wonder if you could comment more on that.
I think probably Rebecca did it deliberately to heighten the contrast, and perhaps I'm overplaying my hand in some sense. But again, I think the chemical industry came of age in the 1870s, where there was no other choice, and so we might be seeing a kind of selection effect. And moreover, starting right then, the German chemical companies that first started investing in in-house R&D managed to realize very significant gains from that, and therefore that business model where you invested in R&D and you made money perhaps got institutionalized. And in America, it took a very significant antitrust action against DuPont before the trustees of the people who were running DuPont were convinced that the only way they could grow was through creating new products and materials and businesses. They could not grow in their existing domains. And so in some sense, and this was a decision that I think serendipitously happened to be right. The other big chemical company in 1920s was Allied Chemicals. Most of you have not heard of them. They were the second biggest chemical company. They chose not to do that. And the consequences were, what Brian?
I think also to look at chemicals, you need to look back into the early part of the 19th century, the development of aniline dyes in the quest for replacement for quinine in antimalarials.
Yes.
In United Kingdom, which wasn't supported by the United Kingdom industrial sector, so it went to the academics in Germany to develop applied technologies in German universities, maybe around the 1840s, and then that became the foundation for the German chemical sector, which then went on to dominate the world so much that in the 1920s and 30s, for example, when an American company got the patent for aspirin, part of war reparations, it couldn't actually develop the technology until it imported experts from Germany to show them how to do it over about a decade. So I think that it's partly the fact that the needed technology was developed way earlier than the 1870s, and we're seeing now the application of that technology going on today, I think.